This time on Poll Hub, it's finally almost time. Iowans are about to caucus, New Hampshireites, Granite Staters, are about to primary, and we continue to poll. What's the latest, and what should you be watching for on caucus night and leading up to the primary? We've got new numbers, so let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
And I'm Mary Griffith, Media Director for the Marist College Poll, and sitting in for Barbara Carvalho today. So the time is finally here. Monday is the Iowa caucus, and there have been a slew of polls over the last week or so, all with kind of differing results in Iowa. Lee, what's going on?
Well, I think you're talking about polls that have done Iowa in the past and have a better sense of it. But, first of all, this is a very volatile situation. No one remembers when you had, in an Iowa caucus, 4 candidates at the top, all within 10 points of each other. So that makes for a lot of horse trading, even beyond the horse trading that occurs once we're in the caucus itself. One of the things we've seen, and clearly Bernie Sanders has had somewhat of a surge, and Joe Biden has had somewhat of a decline. And I think that has a lot to do, to put on our poll hats for a second, in how the different samples are being selected and how people are being, sort of sorted into the pool or not. And in the New York Times Siena poll, there's no pressure there to have a prior vote history to get in. In the Monmouth poll, which is the one that tends to work more in Biden's favor. It's within the margin of error, but numerically Biden's ahead. And they're looking at people who have voted in the 2018 election or a recent primary. And what this means in the bottom line is turnout for caucuses tend to be lower than turnout for primaries or certainly the general election. And because Bernie Sanders, not only in Iowa, but we'll talk later about in New Hampshire, has the more enthusiastic, intense following, if turnout is like a low in typical caucus fashion, then he runs up the score in that kind of atmosphere. If it was a primary and more people voted, then Joe Biden, whose support is a little wider but not as deep, he would do better. So a lot of this has to do with a close moving target, and Iowa has surprised in the past and probably will this time as well.
Yeah, I think there's two things that I'm looking at here. One is, it was interesting, we were talking with Nate Cohn from the New York Times not that long ago, a couple of weeks ago, about the dearth of Iowa polls. And we all knew that some Iowa polls would be coming, but one of the conversations we were having was how challenging it is to poll Iowa for many of the reasons that you just mentioned, Lee. So I think it's interesting that, yes, all these polls have come, and yes, all those caveats have to be laid over them, which is, not everybody polls Iowa well because Iowa's tough to poll. Even the people who poll Iowa well don't always get it right because caucuses are not primaries. But the other thing that's interesting to me is that this actually does seem a little bit to me like the Republican caucus, in 2016.
Last time.
There were a lot of people running, and there were, in this case, 3 people kind of grouped at the top: Donald Trump, Cruz, and Marco Rubio. And the polls, even the best polls, didn't get it right. Trump actually didn't win there. Cruz did, and all the polls had Trump winning. So that's a case where there's a lot of enthusiasm for Trump, you would have thought, and yet that didn't happen because there was a big turnout of evangelical voters who have later become big Trump fans, but at the time were Cruz fans. So
and we've seen that before in New Hampshire Republican caucuses too, in earlier years.
Right, but in New Hampshire, the primary. But here in Iowa, I think the important thing to look at is what you said, Lee, which is the turnout. Is it 2008 when more than 200,000 people showed up, which has never happened? I think it's 200,000, some very large number. Or is it more like it was in 2016, which there was still a lot of excitement, but it was, I believe, in the 120s, 150s, something like that. It was much less.
Yeah. So on the one hand...
And so it really depends on, when you walk into that high school gym, if it's twice as crowded as it's ever been, I don't know that you can say Sanders necessarily benefits from that, but I would think that the odds would be that he would.
Yeah, and then working in that favor of Sanders is if you do have a surge in turnout, he does better among younger people. Joe Biden does better among older folks, and that's been shown in most of the polls, regardless of state. So, a caucus. Are people going to go out and spend an evening, perhaps in the cold, to get there? It doesn't look like it's going to be snowing, but it's going to be chilly, and clearly that favors younger people not voting, and that should move Sanders' way. There's another thing we should talk about before we move on from Iowa, and that is to remind people that there's going to be multiple results from the Iowa caucus. People come in, there'll be an entrance poll, and we talked about this a little last time. There'll be a first preference time of voting. People walk in and they say, that's kind of like the raw count, which is what we're familiar with. But then, as we know, if you don't have 15%, you can move around and, not make the threshold. You may move to another candidate. And so then you see maybe Yang people or maybe some Klobuchar people or some people even for Warren or others in individual precincts who don't make the threshold now can go shopping elsewhere. So that becomes a part. And then after they realign, then you get the state delegate equivalents. And that's what the AP is going to be reporting. But the state party is going to be giving out all those different results. So as we said, I believe last time, and it still holds, there could be multiple winners after all is said and done, which is kind of like an odd thing. But one thing we know, it's expectations too. And if Bernie Sanders wins, he needs to win pretty well. Biden needs to do the same. Then it's that third ticket. And who finishes third? And if Klobuchar edges out Elizabeth Warren, that's a big story. If Buttigieg is third, that might be a big story too, because the expectations matter greatly.
And then, of course, it's on to New Hampshire. So.
Yeah.
Right.
This will all be forgotten, very quickly.
But before we do move on to New Hampshire, the American Association for Public Opinion Research, also known as APOR, they put out a statement earlier this week which cautioned journalists and pundits to not rush to judgment on the polls based on what we're seeing on Monday during and after the Iowa caucuses. And basically, they don't want that judgment to come about. They want journalists and those folks and the general public to keep a few things in mind. Now, my question for the two of you is this a wise thing to do, or is this kind of just drawing attention to the polls in advance of the caucuses and almost, making excuses for what could possibly happen in the aftermath of the caucuses?
Well, I think caucus polling is, by definition, trickier than general election polling, and primary polling is sort of in the middle, and it has to do with how many people show up. And the caucus will have fewer people than a primary or certainly the general, even if it is a high turnout. So I think caution is always probably the smarter step to take here. And then once we get past that, though, it's as Jay said, what's going to happen is Iowa's going to be left in the dust bowl as people fly out and head over to New Hampshire, and then we start all over again.
And there are those three specific things that the statement does point out, and that's to wait for the final caucus results before analyzing a poll's performance. They're also cautioning to take into consideration, and this is coming from their statement, fundamental uncertainty in all sample surveys, and that's usually referred to as the margin of sampling error. And finally, again, this comes back to your point, Lee, about those different figures that are going to be coming out on caucus night, and to not pick and choose which caucus results to compare the polls to. This statement is advising that it's really the initial presidential preference. Presidential preference number that should be the basis for comparison.
Yeah, and I think so. So caution is smart in this instance, and we'll just see as it emerges. But hold on for some confusion and maybe multiple candidates claiming victory, trying to get that bounce, trying to get refocused onto the New Hampshire first in the nation primary, which is a whole different thing.
I think this statement is good as it is, but as a journalist, a former journalist who,
Doesn't
who covered these things, I'm not sure that it moves the needle at all. I'm not sure most journalists would have even seen it. What I would say is that almost all the networks now have polling experts that they put on camera that are in-house. Steve Kornacki, a good friend of ours at MSNBC, for instance, Harry Enton over at CNN, they know this and they talk about this. And I think it's incumbent on their networks to allow them enough airtime on caucus night to say, put on the brakes, people. This doesn't mean what you may think it is. I don't think it's going to be the person standing in a ballroom in Des Moines, the reporter, that is necessarily going to benefit from this. But I think it's really important, and I do hope that the networks and the news organizations give the experts they have hired the space to, tell the truth in this case.
And the early winner in the raw count may not be the person who gets the most delegates at the end. So declaring a winner early, I think the AP is being probably appropriately cautious in this and waiting till the state delegate equivalents get determined. That's, after all, what it's all about, delegates. Although when you get to the convention in the summer, they'll call out Iowa and New Hampshire, and they'll just be faint memories by then.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And so moving on from the First in the Nation caucus to the First in the Nation primary of New Hampshire, we paired up once again with our battleground state polling partners, NBC News, and we released just a few days ago our New Hampshire survey. And among likely Democratic primary voters, including leaners and those who have already voted, what we found is that Bernie Sanders tops the leaderboard, but Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren are close behind, and Amy Klobuchar does receive support in double digits.
Wow. So again, we're looking at a very similar crowded field with no clear frontrunner, although the sense of it is that Bernie Sanders not only has the slight edge in Iowa, but were he to win that and clearly get a clear victory, that might have an impact on the New Hampshire following the next week. And one of the things we saw in our poll that was really jumped out was just this enthusiasm, which you just spoke to a minute ago, Jay, about the enthusiasm advantage of Bernie Sanders supporters, 76% of whom say they strongly support him. Biden's at 56, Warren at 53, Buttigieg 44. So the enthusiasm really drops off for these other candidates, and they're going to have to pick it up if they're going to try to be successful there. And then, there's the difference again between age and the good old lanes, progressive and moderates, which applies both to Iowa and New Hampshire, I guess.
But it seems like so much of this depends on what happens in Iowa and who, if anyone, drops out after Iowa. Because that's both the opportunity for somebody who's dropping out to be, I think, to some degree, a kingmaker or pretty close, or to be the person who kind of stays in and is the reverse kingmaker, helps somebody who they wouldn't necessarily endorse. Because if you look at the numbers out of Iowa, there's going to be people who clearly don't have a path forward. I don't know who they are, but there's clearly going to be people who wake up the next morning with their campaign staff and go, we don't have a path to the nomination. If they drop out and let's just play it out. Let's say it's more moderates. Let's say it's a Klobuchar or somebody like that, and they throw their support behind a Biden. Does that help in a state like New Hampshire with a lot of older voters who are more likely to be, I think, in that moderate lane? At least that's what our polling shows.
Yeah,
I mean, that's one scenario, but I do think a lot of this, these polls tell us it's a snapshot in time. It tells us where New Hampshire voters are right now. The chance that New Hampshire voters are where they are right now on the day of the New Hampshire primary in 2 weeks is, I don't know. I'd rather put $1 million on a number on a blackjack wheel in Vegas because I think I have a better chance of winning.
Well, we will be in Vegas soon with the Nevada caucus, but it is true. First of all, we're going to be doing another poll in New Hampshire closer to the primary, which will be released on NBC. I should point out also that the Des Moines Register Seltzer's poll will do one final poll, which will be out Saturday evening for the Sunday papers in Des Moines, in Iowa, and that is sort of be the last look there. And I think that's going to have an impact, again, in terms of perceptions. But if you can win Iowa and if you can win New Hampshire, that's happened 4 times. And each time, the winner of, if you won both, ends up getting the nomination of the party. They don't necessarily become president, but they get the nomination of the party. So if if Bernie or Biden, for that matter, can do a double header, that's very, very strong. And then it may have an impact on people like Mr. Bloomberg, whose ads we see constantly and whose numbers are getting a little bit better in some of the national polls.
Yeah, and I just want to take a second and talk about the concept of the idea of electability. We've talked about this, at great lengths nationally here on the podcast. And, Lee, what are we seeing in New Hampshire on this end? Is electability the priority for Democrats in New Hampshire?
Well, yes, and they are more prone to going for electability than they are for proximity on issues. The issue voters are more for Bernie Sanders. Not surprisingly, the electability argument works more for Joe Biden. But Joe Biden doesn't overwhelm on that score, and Bernie does a lot better on the issue thing. So you can add them together, and although electability outperforms the issue focus for voters, Biden's not doing enough of it. In other words, and his campaign ads about he's less of a risk now. I don't know if that really, charisses voters as much as, some of the issues do for people.
Well, and the other thing is that in not only in this poll in New Hampshire, where when asked hypothetically if the 2020 election for president were held today, would you vote for Donald Trump and then we name Democrats, and Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden get the same number, which is 51% to 43% for Donald Trump. So he's not less electable in New Hampshire, based on this poll. And he's actually not less electable in many of the national polls that have done these head-to-head hypotheticals. It's not really it's really not that much different. And I think Democratic voters, if there are strategic Democratic voters, and I've always taken the position that there are no strategic voters except in polling shops and in newsrooms. Nobody out there in the real world is a strategic voter. But if there are strategic voters, it just seems to me that Bernie seems just as electable as Biden right now. And there was a conservative columnist who wrote in the last couple of days that many Republicans are licking their chops, apparently, at the idea that Bernie will be the nominee because all they have to do is run. He's an actual socialist, not just kind of. He's an actual socialist ad, and he's done. And this very, prominent conservative writer said, well, if you think that's the truth, you didn't learn the lesson of 2016.
Yeah,
and I think that's true.
If you're a socialist, does that put you to the left or the right of Putin? I'm kind of like a little confused. Anyway,
these terms are very flexible.
Yes, thank you for helping me out there. I do also think, and I agree with you, I think we talk about electability, and clearly Democrats want to be unified and they want to beat Donald Trump, no doubt about that. But I've always, I agree with you because I always do think that issues are what drive voters to the polls. And if you can get a clear issue statement that can be, crafted well, perhaps a more moderate one, but maybe in Bernie Sanders' case, one that's, stands out a little bit on the edges, depending on the turnout. I think the issue can drive the discussion more, particularly in primaries where turnout is not enormous, even if it is higher than normal.
So I bet you can't wait to get to New Hampshire.
I know. We're going to be going up with a group of 28 Marist students and having a grand time, we hope. We hope we come back with 28. I think we will. But we're going to be going to a lot of the news programs, seeing the candidates, and the students will we just met with them in the middle of the week, and kind of like gave them a sense of what it was going to be like. And boy, that was a really enthusiastic bunch. And I think it's just going to be a great couple of days, great education, and nothing like seeing it up close, and nothing like New Hampshire to do that.
And that will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
And Mary Griffith, who in addition to filling in for Barbara Carvalho today, is our executive producer. You just heard from her. Casey Schaff is our editor. And Mary and Barbara and Casey and a whole bunch of others will be heading up. But Mary's really been the ringmaster in this, organizing the New Hampshire stuff. So we should probably give credit to where credit is due.
And Lee is the ringleader.
Yeah, I'm not sure which is better in that case. I'm not sure which. But regardless, we do want to also thank the Roper Center Archives at Cornell for providing us with the ability to look back in time at survey questions. And a lot of this has to do with, how's Iowa gone in the past and how New Hampshire's gone in the past in terms of the polls. Helps us get a sense of who's got the inside track.
And we know because you listen a lot and you let us know that you have questions and comments, and so continue those. Reach out to us on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter, Marist Poll on Facebook and Instagram. It is the best way to reach us, and we do answer questions on the air and comments, so let us know what you have in mind. You also can learn a lot more about polling. We've talked about this in prior episodes. Just another reminder, we've got a free online learning platform called the Marist Poll Academy. It's visual, it's engaging, it's free. Did we mention it's free? And it gives you an opportunity to dig in even deeper than we can do just in a 20-minute podcast. Finally, if you like what you hear on Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review on your podcasting app. The reason is that positive reviews help other people find us. And after all, if you're enjoying this, you might as well let other people know we're out there. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already done so. And if you live in Iowa or New Hampshire, go caucus or go vote if you can, because that would be a good civic thing to do. We'll see you next time.